I was in a drugstore buying some toothpaste, I think, and I happened to look at the rack that they had, paperbacks. And I was just looking through it, and there was a paperback called The Last Picture Show, and I thought, that's an interesting title. Sounds like a good title. I picked it up, looked at the back, and it said, Kids Growing Up in Texas. I said, that doesn't interest me. I put it back. Then, a few months later, two months later, if not less, Sal Mineo, the actor, who's a friend of mine, gave me a copy of the same book. He said, here, you ought to read this. He said, he said, I always wanted to be in it. He said, but I'm a little too old now. But I always thought it'd make a good movie. So I looked at it again, and again it sat by my bed for a little while, and then I asked my wife to read it, who was Polly Platt, who worked with me in production design, and she read it. She said, well, I don't know how you make it as a picture, but it's a good book. And that was the beginning. That's how it started. Writing the script was really not so much writing the script as going through the book and deciding what was going to remain and what was going to be cut out. Because the basic construction of the book and the movie was 1 year from one football season to the next football season in the life of this small town in Texas. That was the basic construction. So, there was a good deal more about the teacher, there was a good deal more about the preacher's son, and there were other characters that we took out. And it was really a question of winnowing out what we were going to keep. And then I added a few things that weren't in the book, like the graduation. I said, this is all about them graduating from high school, and we don't really have the graduation, so we put that in. And the original scene with Sam the Lion at the tank dam, when he tells the story about his affair with JC's mother, was quite different. The monologue in there was different. It was about urinating, and I said, this is not attractive, and can you write something else? And he wrote something else, which was quite good. All the basic dialogue was pretty much as it was in the book. When we were doing the script, I would say to Larry, this scene, you want to try another pass at it? I mean, it's good in the book, but why don't you do it again? So he'd write it again. I'd read it, and I'd say, it's better in the book. He said, well, then use the book, And that was what happened numerous times. The book was not very precise about the year, the period. I mean, it was sort of a general 50s. And so we decided on the end of November 1951 to the end of October 1952. And so then the music was chosen on the basis of that. I used no score, we just used songs from the period. And that was, again, I was rather strict about it. So we didn't use anything that came out after the period movie was over, and only things that had come out before. Cybill, at that time, I mean, I didn't know her at all. She was a model, and I was in a supermarket, and I saw, the checkout stand, I saw her picture on the cover of Glamour magazine, a magazine I'd never noticed before. There was something about her expression that was very piquant.
Peter was in a grocery store and saw one of the covers and said, that's JC, and bought the magazine and took it to the production office and ripped off the cover and put it up bulletin board and said, we find that girl. But I remember I had my hair up a little bit and had a kind of wicked smile on my face and a T-shirt that said, I love you, 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 all over the T-shirt. It was kind of pink and white. And I looked sort of mean and sweet at the same time.
We arranged for me to meet her when I went to New York to cast, because we did some casting in New York, in Dallas, in Houston, and in Los Angeles. And I was at the Essex House. She came up to see me with her manager or agent, and she was wearing blue jean jacket and then blue jeans and some kind of shirt, white shirt. Big girl, tall, and broad, and she was very interested in going through college and not particularly interested in being movies, but she liked the script, and she thought it was an interesting part.
I wasn't too impressed with movie people, and every model I knew was studying acting, wanted to be an actor. And I'm very kind of stubborn and somewhat perverse in that I thought, ugh, these people, all these models and the actors.
So I went back to California and I said, this is the girl I want to use. And they said, well, how do you know she can act? I said, I don't know, I think she can.
The producer, Bert Schneider, wanted me to do a screen test. And Peter was saying, no, she can't do a screen test. She won't be any good. I know she can do this part. You've got to believe me. And Bert Schneider, I could just tell, he was like, you know, he wasn't convinced. He located a screen test. It's one I had done with Roger Vadim about a year before, in which I was doing Cat on a Hot Tin Roof scenes silent, because they didn't record the sound, and dancing silently to Rolling Stones' Black Sugar or something. And Peter said, oh, you found a screen test. He was quite alarmed. And when he sat down and saw it with Bert Schneider after it was over, he told me later, after I completely finished the film and everything, it's the only time he ever doubted that I might be able to play the part was when he saw the screen test. But he stuck by it. He insisted that I play the part. And I came to Los Angeles, and I read with John Ritter and Bob Mitchum's son, as well as Jeff Bridges and Timothy Bottoms.
John Ritter was up for the part of Sonny, and he brought his father, Tex Ritter, to play Sam the Lion, and I remember them sitting there. And I would say that Tex Ritter came closest to playing it, but I got my heart set on Ben Johnson, and I wouldn't take any other person. I kept saying to Ben, I want you to do this. Oh, Pete, no, there's too many words, Pete.
He used to say to me, God, I'd rather ride my horse 1,000 miles than say any of these goddamn words. He hated to talk.
So I called John Ford. Of course, Ben Johnson had worked for Ford, you know, and Ford discovered him. Ford said, oh, Jesus, well, give me the number, I'll call him. Phone rings a few minutes later, and Ben, you put the old man on me. Finally, I said to him, Ben, you don't understand. You, in this role, are going to get an Academy Award. And he looked at me and he got really angry. He says, why the hell do you say that? I said, I don't know, you'll at least get a nomination, I'm telling you. I think you in this part, dynamite. Well, finally, I remember, I'll never forget it. He slammed the script shut. And he said, all right, I'll do the damn thing. Timothy came up. I thought he'd be good. He had very sad eyes. And he was being highly touted at the time by his agent, who said he had the lead in the Dalton Trumbo movie, Johnny Got His Gun. And so I guess that's what convinced me.
I think it was back when I really just first started to go out in interviews. And I went for a casting call, basically. And as Peter tells the story, he saw me come in to the office and he said, oh, there's Dwayne.
Jeff came in and read with Cybill, I think. Jeff was so likable that I thought he would be very interesting in this part, because the character as written, Dwayne as written in the book and in the original script, not a very likable character, but I thought Jeff playing it would give the character some additional depth and some additional warmth and not make him such a bastard. We were having a hard time figuring out who to have play the three older women who were all in their mid-30s. And Bob Rafelson was one of the producers on the picture, and I said, Bob, I'm having trouble with these older women. And he gave me a list. He made out a list of about 20 older women, and on the list were about 20 people, including Cloris, Ellen Burstyn, and Eileen Brennan. So we saw all 20 people. Now, Ellen Burstyn came in, and I thought she was very interesting.
I was sent up to read for the part of the waitress that Eileen Brennan eventually played. And I read it in the script, and I thought, well, yeah, I could play that part, but I kind of like Lois. So when I went in to meet Peter to read for him, I said, I'll be glad to read the part of the waitress, but I really like Lois. Could I read for that too? And he said, sure.
So she read for all of them. And I've never done this before. or since?
He offered me the part of Ruth Popper, and I said I didn't really want to play that part, that I preferred Lois. And Peter said to me,
Well, you gave a great reading for all three parts, so I tell you what, you go home tonight and call me and tell me which one you want to play. Whichever one you want to play is the part you'll get. You're in the picture, so you decide. So she called me next morning. She said, I'd like to play the young girl's mother. I said, okay. That was it. She cast herself. Cloris came in, and she just gave a wonderful reading for the coach's wife.
The first thing I remember is meeting Peter at the office, I think. I think he asked me what part I'd like to play. It was interesting that I ended up with Ruth Popper. Don't you love that name? Oh, doesn't that tell you who you are immediately? You have to overcome a name like that, or live with it, or suffer it. If you think about what the kids must have done to her in school. With nicknames, I know what they did with my name in real life.
I had seen Eileen Brennan on the stage in Little Mary Sunshine in New York in the 60s, and just thought she'd be good. She had a kind of a good face for that.
When I read that script, I can remember the first time I read it, I was just overwhelmed by the power of that script. I mean, there was no question in my mind what I was embarking on, and I wanted so much to be a part of it.
I went over, I said, who are you? And he smiled, he said, well, I'm Sam Bottoms. I said, you related to Tim Bottoms? He said, yeah, I'm his brother. I said, what the hell are you doing here? He said, well, I'm coming to visit Tim for a few days. I said, do you act? He shrugged. He said, well, I said, could you take those braces off? He said, I have to ask my mom if I can take my braces off. I said, well, if you can take your braces off, I'll put you in the picture.
My history with Last Picture Show is kind of simple. It was my second movie that I ever worked on, and I worked on Peter Bogdanovich's first movie called Targets back in 1967. And we had a great experience together, and he said, well, if I ever do another movie, you're on it, and he was true to his word. And so when Last Picture Show came up 3 years later, he asked me to come work on it. So I started really being a kind of assistant production manager, and then doing the locations and doing the money, and then I acted in the movie. And so I had a lot of different jobs and worked very closely with Polly Platt, who was the production designer, to find the locations and give the right look to the picture, and of course working very closely with Peter as well.
The town where we shot the film was in fact Larry McMurtry's hometown, and the town he wrote about. I'd never been to Texas, really. So we drove around for a couple of days, all over. Larry loves to drive. We drove all over Texas, ended up down near Corpus Christi. And we saw exactly one town that I thought was fair through all that time. Then we drove on up to Archer City. And as we drove into Archer City, I said, my God, this is perfect. And Larry said, well, it ought to be. This is the town I wrote about.
I remember walking in the streets of Archer City where we shot the film, and watch people walking around the streets, and somebody would say, you know, that's the real Dwayne there, that's the guy. You know, it was all based on people that actually lived in the town.
I did not meet the real Lois, although I met her friends who talked about her and described her. But I didn't meet the woman herself. I don't think she came around. I'm not quite sure why. But it was very nourishing creatively to be in that town and to be, you know, the movie house was still there.
Who was a tremendous help was a young fellow named Lloyd Catlett, who was a local high school kid. He was maybe a couple of years younger than we were. And he was hired for a role in the film, as well as to be our coach, to give us dialogue, you know, what that kind of accent in West Texas sounds like, looking at just the way he moved, how he spoke, what things were important to him. And that was the biggest research I did with him. We were just hanging out with him, hanging out with Lloyd.
We all just hung out with him and picked up his way of talking and then just stayed in the accents.
The people of the town were not, and in the area, were not real happy to see their dirty underwear sort of aired out and the underside of the city, because I think a lot of these towns have these things going on. It's life, but nobody talks about it, and particularly then. You know, this is 1970. So certainly when Larry was there, they were going on, and it's really, you know, it's life. And there were little parties at these little places where people took their clothes off, and the kids were always getting into trouble, and kids were getting pregnant, and all. It was all going on, but nobody talked about it. And so the town was kind of upset that this came out and it was about their town, but, you know, it was true.
The decision was made to shoot in black and white, which was something that Orson Welles suggested to me, because I thought nobody would let us, so it hadn't even occurred to me. And then I was discussing with Orson Welles at breakfast one day how I wanted it to have a tremendous amount of depth of field. He said, "You'll never get it in color." So I said, "Well, I don't know how I'm going to do it." He said, "Well, do it in black and white." I said, "Well, they won't let me." He said, "Why don't you ask them?" I said, "Well." So I said to Bert Schneider, "I would like to shoot it in black and white." He said, "Why?" So I didn't say, "Well, Orson Welles told me to." I said something like, "Well, I think the period be easier to convey in black and white," which is true. And I think that the actors, the performances will be better. Well, Bert went back to the studio and came back a week later and said, "All right, this movie had to be brilliantly acted." So it was the only time I ever did this on a picture. I absolutely refused to have lunch or dinner or whatever it was with anybody but the actors. Nobody was allowed to sit at the actors' table except me and the actors. The crew was very annoyed.
Peter will be the first one to admit to you, on the last picture show, he wasn't the nicest person. He was out, he was fighting every inch of his way for the life to make a great film. He didn't care if the crew hated him. Half of them hated him, most of them hated him.
Crew did not like me on that picture because I excluded them, paid no attention to them, and didn't even talk to them because I was so focused on the actors.
There was an associate producer that came in and was giving me line readings on the side, and I didn't know what to do. I'd never acted before, and I went in, and Peter said to me one day, "What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?" He said, "Well, this producer was telling me I'm not being lively enough or something." And he was furious. There was a script supervisor who gave me like a little line reading or something, and he was fired. Because the interesting thing is that because of my lack of acting experience, none, I was highly susceptible to anyone saying anything about my performance. I didn't know. And Peter was guarding that, and it was guarded it like a lion, like protecting his babies or something. Like, don't talk to her, you know. And it was smart.
It was that wonderful time where somehow the people that came together were at a point in their lives, at least this is the way I saw it, where they could all just bond.
We used to have lunch together all often, and we used to say, "Gee, something about this feels very special. What is this? Do you feel that?" And I'll say, "Yeah, yeah."
We all spent a lot of time together, and you know, we would all gather in one of our hotel rooms, and Jeff had his guitar, and he would play the guitar, and we would sing and get high together, and we had a lot of fun together. It was a real company.
Well, I was really surprised because I thought all these actresses that were like, 10 or 15 years older than me would be mean because I was like the young beauty and they would hate my guts, And I got down there on location and they were all wonderful to me. They are three extraordinarily generous and talented women that Peter found at the prime.
It was very interesting to see how much the actors got into their roles. And I just recently found out that Jeff Bridges actually did sketches of all the different characters that were on the set. And so he was so into the movie that he, felt this sort of need to put down on paper what all these people and who all these people were and what they looked like. So I really thought it was an amazing process that all the actors went through because they got into the movie so much. The nude scene, a very famous scene, not only in the movie, but in the making of the movie. Obviously, first of all, I had to find the place to shoot the nude scene. because it was supposed to be an indoor swimming pool, which there were several of in the area. It was a very sort of people who were very wealthy in the area had these big ranch houses, and a lot of them had indoor swimming pools. But we couldn't really find anybody that would let us shoot this scene in their swimming pool, because it was a nude scene, and certainly there were no, in those days, everybody was very conservative and very prudish. I found a spa kind of place in this little kind of mall area in Wichita Falls, and we took it over and we built a set around their pool.
My big quandary on Picture Show was, should I do the nude scene or not? Peter had said, look, you don't have to commit to the nude scene. When it comes the day to shoot it, we're going to talk about it, and you're not going to have to do it if you don't want to. And which was the only way I would have agreed to do the picture. I started nagging Peter to sign something. I even gave him a piece of paper. I said, look, I've had my lawyer write this up. I want you to sign it and get Bert Schneider to sign it as producers, say that if I do the nude scenes, no still photos can be published anywhere else, anywhere. And I was walking up through some mesquite trees, and I was saying, Peter, I really need you to sign that. And he turned to me and said, if you ever mention that again, I will never give you another piece of direction. He turned away and walked away, and I never mentioned it again.
She was nervous about doing the nudity, and I was nervous about it because by the time we did it, I had fallen for her, and we had started an affair, so of course it was more difficult to do it.
Frame enlargements were gotten by Playboy, and I sued Playboy. And as a result of my lawsuit, we got it into the Screen Actors Guild that you have to have an actor's written permission to print a nude still.
One of the things that happens on a movie is that you're going along creating this other story that's really a life story, a story about life. And you sort of go into what I call the tunnel, and everything else drops away. But you have to remember that real life goes on as well. And one of the real sad things that happened during the movie was that Peter's father passed away. And, it became a terrible dilemma for Peter to stop the movie that he was shooting, which was really his big start in Hollywood, and deal with the death of his father. And he had to go back to Phoenix and deal with the funeral and everything.
And then right after that, we shot the scene with Sam's funeral.
Well, the one thing that I always felt about Peter when I first met him and when I first worked on Targets and then on Last Picture Show is that he knew what he wanted. Right or wrong, he knew what shots he wanted, and he had studied the great directors of the past, and he had noticed that a lot of them didn't do a lot of coverage. Now, in those days, I didn't know what coverage was. I was fascinated by how he would shoot the movie.
This was my second picture, and I never had heard the expression master. A master scene. Well, as you know, a master scene is basically one camera position that shows the entire scene. It was about a 4.5, 5-page scene. And the actors, Tim and Jeff and I, had rehearsed it because it was such a complicated scene not only in terms of a lot of dialogue and physical, but also I didn't want to just have the two of them standing there. So they knew exactly how I was going to cut it. And so I'd let them rehearse it a few times straight through without interrupting them, so that they would get what it would feel like, knowing that they were going to have to be interrupted when we shot it. Never even thought to have a master, didn't see what the purpose was. So anyway, we started to shoot it, and I remember the continuity fellow, the fat man, Marshall Schlamm, and Robert Surtees, the cameraman, came over to me and took me aside, and they said, Peter, aren't you going to shoot a master? I said, what? And they said, aren't you going to shoot a master? I said, what's that? They said, the whole scene without cutting, so you know where they are. I said, what do you mean, so I know where they are? Well, you don't know where they are. I said, yes, I do. I didn't know what they were talking about. I thought I was losing my mind. Well, as it turned out, we shot it exactly the way I wanted to. We did not shoot a master. We shot it in pieces, exactly the way it planned. It was about 45 setups. When the dailies came to Hollywood, Bert Schneider looked at them and got worried, and he called Bob Rafelson, who was a director. As you know, he directed 5 Easy Pieces and so on. And Bert was a producer. So he called Bob. He said, Bob, I want you to look at these dailies He said, because I think I'm in trouble. I mean, there's no master shot, and I don't know how this is going to cut. So they looked at it. And Bob afterwards stood up and said, he's cutting in the camera. He said, what? He said, this is going to cut like butter. I mean, he's cutting in the camera. You look at it, you'll see, you cut the slates off and it'll cut. He said, really? I said, yeah, he knows what he's doing. Leave him alone. They were going to fire me. But he said, fire him? Are you crazy? He said, he knows exactly what he's doing. Leave him alone.
Peter Bogdanovich and I both figured that our romance was over when the movie wrapped. And then I went home to Memphis for the holidays, and he tried to go back to his life here in California, and we were both devastated by not having each other. He missed me terribly, and I missed him, and I flew out to meet him in California, and I spent many a night really sleeping on a couch in the editing room as he cut picture show on a moviola.
That's when the picture started to look pretty good to me as I was putting it together. And I did that for about 6 months. Bert Schneider said, do you want to take credit as editor? And I said, no. It says directed, and I wrote the script with Larry, and what's it going to say? Edited by? I mean, I thought that was a bit much. So Bert called me in his office. He says, the Editors Guild says you got to give somebody credit. I said, that's ridiculous. He said, well, we got to do it. It's a union picture. If you can take the credit, if you want it. He said, I said, I don't want to take the credit. It's just going to look ridiculous. He said, well, who are you going to give it? You got to give it to somebody. I said, well, give it to Don. Don Cameron was at that time editing Drive, he said, right next door. And just as I was finishing up the picture, I was starting to prepare What's Up, Doc, and I had to order some opticals, the dissolves and a couple of things like that. And I asked Don if he would order them for me, because you have to do some paperwork. So that's what he did. He ordered the dissolves and got credit for this picture. I was shooting What's Up, Doc, and the phone rang, and it was Bert Schneider. And he said, are you sitting down? And I said, yeah. He said, okay, Newsweek magazine. You ready for this? Here's the opening line. The Last Picture Show is the most important film by a young American director since Citizen Kane. I said, Jesus Christ, really? And he said, yeah, that's what it says. And I hung up, and I went out, and I thought, oh, I must be pretty smart, and I must be pretty good. But I couldn't think about it too long, because I had to do the shot, So that was one memory. The other one was when I was in Stockholm doing a little publicity for the picture, and again Bert calls me up, and I'm in a hotel in Stockholm, and he says, Peter, you sitting down? I said, just a minute. I sat down. I said, yeah, I am now. He says, 8, count them, 8 Academy Award nominations. I said, he said, yeah, 2 of them for you. I said, well, Best Picture, I count on that. That's 3 of them for me as I count. He said, oh, all right, 3 of them for you.